Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bible reading plan. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 today, and Paul is making a defense for himself in this chapter, whereas the church in Corinth has created factions and some people question the apostleship of Paul, and some people consider Paul to be weak as he is someone who is thrown off a lot of things. You know, he presents himself as weak, and they value strength, and he is just a leader that a lot of people are not respecting because of these freedoms that Paul has thrown off in himself. And he makes his defense here, and it kind of sums it up well in verse 6. He says, "Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living first, who serves as a soldier at his own expense, who plants a vineyard without eating of any of its fruit, or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk?" So he's showing that he threw off his freedom. He had the freedom of being paid for his ministry, but he threw that off. And he says, "Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right," talking about being compensated for his money. He's thrown off these freedoms. He's showing he has freedom in Christ, but some freedoms he is willing to throw off so that these new churches might receive God more fully. As he's making these new churches, he's not going to ask money for them, as is his right, as his freedom in Christ to do so, as God commands for pastors to be paid. As he says, don't muzzle the ox who treads out the grain. And he says, like, as he's going through, he's making these new churches, he's giving up that freedom. And he says in verse 14, "In the same way the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. For I would rather die than anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting." So he's saying, I'm giving up this freedom of being paid so that you may see the gospel more clearly as I go and I plant these churches. In verse 18, "So what then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, as to not make full use of my rights in the gospel." So the gist here is Paul is prepared and willing and does give up any freedom that might bar or might hinder people from the gospel. And he is living, like we've been talking about, in this communal mindset where he is giving up his freedoms so that more people might find the gospel. Paul has found freedom in Christ, and he is giving up those freedoms. He's living in light of those around him. He's living in light of this community around him, of the other people who are finding faith, who are around him. And this bleeds into Paul saying in verse 19, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all." And that's what we've been talking about. We are free, so now we can make ourselves a servant to those and lift other people up, just like Jesus did, "that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win the Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law." So he's saying, when I went to those under the law, I practiced that which was under the law. And this was a big thing, in this time. The Gentiles were worried that they would have to become Jew before they become Christian, and this was a confusing process. But Paul, he clarifies in Acts. He's like, no, you can go from a Gentile to a Christian. You don't have to go from Gentile to the process of becoming a Jew to process of becoming a Christian. You can just become Christian through Jesus Christ and faith in him. So this is a kind of groundbreaking thing, but I think Paul is kind of putting the hammer on the head right now. He says, "I became all things to all people," and it's contextualizing. It's the idea that when we go and present the gospel, a lot of times we want people to look like us. There was in history, we look back at like missionaries from the West going to China, and they convert people to Christianity, and then they make them eat Western food, do Western things, sing Western songs, use English, and wear Western clothing. But these Chinese people, that's not very appealing to them. So then missionaries would go over and they would start dressing, they would start speaking Chinese, they would start hanging out with Chinese people, eating like they did, and then preaching the gospel to them. They were all things to all people. Just like Paul in Gentile circles, he exercises freedom in Christ, and he has the traditions of the Gentiles, or eats like them. And when he's with Jews, he eats like the Jewish people. He's all things to all people. And I think if sometimes we're we're not careful, and we push other things other than the Bible onto people, of our way of living, how we do things. As we've been talking about in church, our scruples, we push our own convictions on them that might not be biblical, but we need to preach God, Jesus and Him crucified, show them the Bible, and love them in their own context. Be all things to all people. Teach the gospel in the way they would understand. Paul is saying, so I may save more of them, so I may introduce more of them to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's our goal, is to preach Jesus, Him crucified, and to do all we can to bring more people to the gospel. But thank you for joining me in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 today. I hope to see you tomorrow. Bye.